thank you very much for joining today's Arria meeting. We thought it would be useful, since this Sunday will mark 6 months since the Tatmadaw seized power in Myanmar, and what started as a political coup has now become a multifaceted crisis with political, economic, health and humanitarian dimensions that I think everyone is well aware of, and the conflict has escalated. More than 5,000 people have been detained. I think colleagues will know too that the COVID situation is of particular concern. The coup has resulted in a near total collapse of the healthcare system, and healthcare workers are being attacked and arrested. The virus is spreading through the population very fast indeed. By some estimates, in the next 2 weeks, half of the population of Myanmar could be infected with COVID. So the situation is clearly very concerning. Colleagues will recall that we adopted Security Council Resolution 2565 in February, and that was conceived in part with crises like the one that Myanmar now faces in mind. So I think it's vital that we consider how to implement in Myanmar the call in Security Council Resolution 2565 for ceasefires to allow the distribution of vaccines and the delivery of essential humanitarian assistance. At the same time, of course, progress on the political track is more important than ever. We very much welcome ASEAN's work to support a solution, and the ASEAN 5-point consensus could represent an important foundation, but as we know, implementation has been slow. So we call again for the Tatmadaw to take their commitments seriously, and we'll continue to consider all options available to the Security Council to encourage progress. So today's meeting follows our previous Arria Formula meeting in April and is a further opportunity to hear from voices within Myanmar on the challenges facing the country and the prospects for resolving the crisis. As the military continues to try to silence the people of Myanmar, the international community wants to hear them speak, and it is essential that they have a voice in our discussion at the UN and in the Security Council. The UK continues to stand with the people of Myanmar in their fight for democracy and in calling for an end to the coup. And I'd like to thank in advance all of our briefers for joining us today. I'm going to start by giving the floor to our 2 briefers. We may have some internet connections and we will do our best to work around them to ensure a smooth event. And then I will invite council members and others who wish to speak to do so. So I'm going to start by giving the floor to Susanna So, the National Unity Government's spokesperson for Women, Youth and Children's Affairs, to discuss the challenges facing Myanmar and the National Unity Government's vision for a federal democracy. And if Susanna's internet connection fails, we have got a pre-recorded version of her statement if necessary. But over to you, Susanna. Thank you.
Okay.
Susanna, you're on mute still. Susanna, you're on mute.
Excellencies, as a representative of National Unity Government and the people of Myanmar, thank you for allowing me to brief the Security Council and the ASEAN member states represented in today's Arria meeting. 6 months have passed since the military stolen our people's sense of security and freedom and denied us to live in a safe and secure environment amidst the global pandemic. The Tatmadaw brutal and violent crackdown continue against those expressing their aspiration for federal democracy and rejection of gender's rule. Since February 1, the military has already killed over 900 civilians during protests and interrogations after being illegally detained. It is crucial to mention that out of those killed, over 17% are young women. Thousands are still in detention facing torture and threats of COVID-19. The number of internally displaced people across the country continue to rise. Food insecurity growing. The economy is collapsing, and the health system has collapsed. With a new wave of COVID-19 spreading like wildfire across the country, it is unfortunate that more lives will be lost as the military weaponized COVID-19 against the people. Excellencies, the coup has failed, and it's crucial to recognize that Tatmadaw has led us to this political instability and public health emergency. We have lost innocent lives, damaged properties, and opportunities for our people. After 70 years of military rule at gunpoint, the people of Myanmar are determined to change the course of history and fight for democracy. Pro-democracy and anti-gender movements persist despite the continuous atrocities of the Tatmadaw in the last 6 months. The CSO, women organizations, CDM, and different ethnic groups remain committed to working with NUG, not with Tatmadaw State Administration Council. The National Unity Government, NUG, emerged from the massive protests against the coup that have involved almost every element of Myanmar society. The NUG consists of elected officials who managed to avoid arrest, ethnic representatives, and prominent members of protest movements. Thus, the NUG draws its legitimacy not only from the fact that it is composed of duly elected public officials, but also from the people's support. It is the closest entity that country currently has to a legitimate representative body embodying the people's will. The NUG is the most representative governing body ever formed in Myanmar. This refers not only to its diversity in age, ethnicity, gender, and religion, but also its commitment to safeguarding human rights for those groups that have historically been marginalized. For the first time, the NUG has established Ministry of Human Rights and Ministry of Women, Youth and Children Affairs. The NUG cabinet members have reaffirmed their commitment to the rights of all ethnic minority groups, including Rohingyas, referring to them for the first time in official communication as citizens. The NUG has also vowed to abolish the 1982 citizenship law, which formed a basis for excluding the Rohingyas and stripping off their identity and rights as citizens of Myanmar. Furthermore, the NUG agrees to comply with any future rulings from International Court of Justice, ICJ. Given the country's history of ethnic strife since its founding in 1948, the international community should acknowledge the NUG's remarkable achievement in adopting such unprecedented position. As a Union Minister for Women, Youth and Children Affairs, allow me to share how the coup impact women, youth and children and ministry initiative to perform its mandate despite the limitations. MOWYC received many complaints and reports of gender-based violence and sexual violence committed by SAC forced to illegally detain women and girls. The ministry convened the hearing section on April 25th, with women detaining survivors, relatives, and friends. The stories were heartbreaking. Activist women and girls were raped at detention center by SAC security force. Military constitute crimes against humanity. Thus, the perpetrators of the atrocities must be held accountable. Currently, the MOWIC, directly linked with UNSG Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, an independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar, to ensure such cases are reported and documented. MOWIC is also organizing the CDM working under the ministry in different areas of Myanmar. For the time being, one deputy director is serving as in charge of Children Affairs Department, while 570 CDMers are working with MOWIC to support pregnant women, youth, and children, especially those detained, and providing maternal kits and medicines. Now, let me draw your attention to the surge of COVID-19 as the infection rate in the country is spiraling out of control. While the military council reported 6,000 positive cases and 400 deaths due to the COVID-19, it is undeniable that this is just the tip of iceberg due to the lack of systematic data collection process and the absence of a working system and mechanisms to prevent the spread of the virus. There is also growing evidence that the military council is purposely targeting the healthcare workers. Myanmar is now one of the most dangerous places for healthcare professionals, with more than 250 attacks on frontline workers and medical staff documented this year. Last week, Myanmar's military arrested several doctors treating COVID-19 patients independently. The NUG is doing our best towards a people-centered COVID-19 response to ensure equitable access to vaccination and PPEs for all people of Myanmar. We have developed a national deployment vaccination plan in accordance with the guidance of WHO and UNICEF. Since its formation on April 16, the NUG has called for recognition from the international community as the only legal and legitimate government of Myanmar. In practical terms, recognition would grant the NUG much needed resources to be able to respond to the needs of our people. Myanmar is at critical point. With each passing day that the international community fails to take decisive action to recognize NUG, Myanmar moves closer to becoming a failed state. Considering the deteriorating economy and humanitarian condition or the volume number of COVID-19 cases amid a collapsing healthcare system, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Michelle Bachelet recently warned that the country could plunge into all-out civil war if nothing is done. We urgently need the international community to do all necessary means to prevent further loss of lives due to the atrocity of the military gender and COVID-19. We urgently need political will, leadership, and most important, action from the international community so we can bring Myanmar back to democracy and bring about stability for our people and for our neighbors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Susanna, for your briefing, setting out so clearly the critical situation, but also the important role for the international community. I'm going to pass the floor now to Gum Song Ang, the Secretary General of the Kachin Political Interim Coordination Team, who will also talk about the challenges facing the country, as well as the ethnic dimension of the crisis. Over to you.
Madam Chair, member of Security Council, distinguished guests, and ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for today. It is my great honor to address in this Arria Formula meeting of the UN Security Council situation in Burma, especially as it marks the first for an ethnic Kachin to brief this council in 76 years since its founding. And we look forward to broader engagement with member states in the future. I would like to share our perspective as the spokesperson for Kachin Political Interim Coordination Team, KPICT, as Burma stands on the verge of state collapse, posing major humanitarian and health risks to international peace and security. Before I address the prevailing challenges in our country, I'd like to offer my deepest condolences to the families of 6,133 victims and counting who lost their lives to COVID, and to the families of 934 civilians who were killed by the military in the past 6 months, and thousands who died during civil war and genocide campaigns against Rohingya. Words cannot describe your pain and agony, but you'll always remember in our thoughts and prayers. In recent days, our social media feeds have been flooded with funeral service announcements and prayer requests for swift recovery. As people suffering from COVID battles to gain access to oxygen and medicine, the deceased are unable to rest in peace, as incinerators are in major crematoriums are incapacitated due to the surging death tolls. We honor all health workers who risked their lives serving COVID victims. We will never forget the 5,370 prisoners of conscience who are unlawfully detained by an illegal regime. Your bravery will forever be etched in the hearts of your fellow countrymen. Your Excellencies, I'd like to now introduce to you about the Kachin people and the challenges we are facing. We're a population of over 1 million who lives in Burma's northern frontier, foothill of the Himalayas, home to the imperial jade and land of the highest peak in Southeast Asia. We call half of the world's population our neighbors. Kachin is the only state in the Union which shares border both with China and India. We're known as Singapore in India and Jingpo-su in Yunnan, China. In 1947, Kachin, along with other ethnic groups, co-founded this Union of Burma, predicated upon the principle of equality and self-determination. After a decade of abnegation of these principles, the Kachin began armed resistance against the Burmese government in 1961. 33 years later, and after numerous failed attempts, a formal ceasefire agreement was signed in 1994 between KIO-KIA and ruling junta called State Law and Order Restoration Council. This agreement was forged during the period of repressive campaign against pro-democracy movement. In 1990, junta held a general election only to overthrow the result after the NLD had won a landslide victory. This assault on democracy was followed by throwing activists and elected members of parliament into prison and labor camp across Burma. On June 9, 2011, civil war resumed in Kachin region, and since then, residents of Kachin State and Northern Shan State have been brutally raped, ruthlessly murdered, and extrajudicially executed by the military. Under the moniker of democratic transition and national reconciliation with pro-democracy forces, the Burma Army evaded serious international responses for war crimes, crime against humanity, and genocide in this very 21st century. In Kachin State, over 130,000 civilians have been forcibly displaced due to the fighting. As the military consolidated its grip on power, there has been wholesale land confiscation, racketeering, plundering of natural resources, and destruction of pristine forests on an industrial scale. According to the Global Witness, in 2014 alone, Kachin jade mines generated a revenue of $31 billion. That's 10 times the United Nations budget for 2020. Yet more than 80% of Kachin Hill residents still do not even have a proper bed to go to bed at night. By 2000, Burma had become the next net exporter of refugees and illicit drugs to its neighbor, burdening global community with financial obligations and embarrassing even to its staunchest allies. Today, history is repeating itself again. The third-generation military chief, an aspiring dictator, doubled down on violence and bloodbath to wage in an outcome similar to that of his predecessor, Ne Win and Tan Shui. Dear honorable members, since the advent of social media, quasi-democracy, and nascent engagement with the international community, the minds of Burmese people have been forever changed. 6 months of failed coup is a proof that voices of our younger generation, Gen Z, cannot be silenced by obscene violence and military might alone. Prodigious number of youth across Burma braved through bullets, rockets, and tear gas to demonstrate their genuine desire to be free. Thousands of security force personnel joined CDM movement despite the risk of court-martial and death sentence. The exceptional level of women's participation and their leadership in this movement, people's movement, should be recognized and applauded. All of this should serve as a testament that at the end of the day, the Burmese people and the humanity will prevail. The February 1st coup has reaffirmed the people of Burma's understanding that this military does not serve in the interest of any ethnic group, any religious community, or even the very institution it claims to represent. Its principal purpose is to perpetuate the rule of unstable, irrational junta elites. Even during the best of days for Burma democracy, the Burma's people's ballot was considered just 3/4 of a vote because 1/4 was automatically reserved for the military. Your Excellencies, it is important to note that if the current level of COVID mismanagement is kept unabated, Burma could potentially turn into a petri dish for the next strain of deadly COVID virus. Our concerns are growing for the rising number of COVID cases in IDP camps. If our past serve any lessons, we should know that Burma lost over 138,000 precious lives due to Cyclone Nargis, due to mismanagement and recklessness of this very institution in May of 2008. At the current speed of Delta strain spread, if left unchecked, it could tax a heavy toll on global financial health and security. This coup has caused irreparable harm to the already embattled COVID economy in Burma. It is teetering on a meltdown. The World Bank estimates Burma's GDP to contract by a staggering 18% by fiscal year ending in September. The UNDP estimates 50% of the country's population to be living below the poverty line by 2022. That's double that of 2019. In an agriculture-based society, lack of support during the monsoon season will strike a debilitating blow to the harvesting season this autumn. The new privacy law and cybersecurity law will chastise many IT businesses due to lack of compliance. This will empower uncompetitive, uninnovative military-related enterprise to take control of the sector. Threat of violence has been the singular factor slowing down the possibility of major bank run in the past months, but it is an unsustainable approach to mitigate insolvency. Additionally, the 23% currency depreciation against dollar will make debt obligation much harder to meet. Large divestment by multinational corporations in recent weeks due to looming systemic risk will pay for additional exits, resulting in a ravaged economy. Amid these prevailing national challenges, KPICT was created in a series of meetings between March 8th and 11th, consisting of 5 domestic and diaspora Kachin organizations. Its primary purpose is to coordinate Kachin's interim political goals, which are 1, to affirm the national sovereignty is derived from the people, 2, to end authoritarianism and promulgate a genuine federal union, and 3, to partner with like-minded domestic and international organizations that shares our political goals. Under these guiding principles, we forge a political alliance with CRPH, committee representing Pilyangsu Lutda, to swiftly implement our shared objective. Therefore, KPICT members now serve in the cabinet of the National Unity Government. I must admit that Kachin community has had rough patches with the NLD government in the past, but we're clear-eyed about the prospect of the collective future. The cost of division will only play into the hands of the repressive regime. Despite pain and suffering, despite sickness and disease, despite hardship and terror, we see hope. We see what lies beyond this period. We see we can see light at the end of the tunnel. We see that February 1st coup had placed the nation onto fast track to national unity and national cohesion. As such, I call this period the crucible of hope. Solidarity within and across ethnic and religious community is at a sobering height. In Kachin state, the intertribal tensions, which we witnessed up till even before the coup, hardly exist now. There may be talks of complaints and issue in promulgating Federal Democratic Charter and UCC or the unity government. But one thing which is abundantly clear is that all stakeholders are seeking durable solution to decade-old grievances by offering open and frank discussions, sometimes even unabashedly. This is a positive step forward for our nation, and also set as a reminder to the NLD that this fight is not just about restoring democracy. Democracy without equality is no democracy at all. The alternative to NUG is not the junta, which in its current iteration is self-titled Self-Administrative Council. This moment is the last chance for the nation to live up to the promises of its founding. We will no longer tolerate to return to the horror past of the military regime and relive the status quo of the former years. In conclusion, we'd like to express our sincere appreciation to the UN Security Council's steadfast concern for the people of Burma and echo the February 4th statement about upholding democratic institutions. Moreover, while we consider ASEAN's 5-point consensus to be a great step forward, the current health crisis demands immediate, robust action. To that end, we urgently call upon the good offices of Secretary General to convene a meeting with key stakeholders, including China and ASEAN, to engage all concerned parties. International health crisis management team should be dispatched to work directly with communities to administer vaccine and humanitarian assistance. Cross-border aid is essential to control and mitigate the spread. And we also call upon the Security Council to impose an international arms embargo and no-fly zone along Myanmar's border with China, India, and Thailand to enhance the border security, and also to impose targeted sanctions against SAC members and state-owned enterprise, including Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise, which funds egregious human rights abuses and empower costly war, and also to deny the military junta any recognition in the United Nations, and to ensure the accountability of crime of aggression against civilians by referring the situation of Myanmar to International Criminal Court. These are the most suitable arrangements to foster peace. The past 10 years of normalization efforts in Burma have proved to us that engagement alone will not deter the army from its campaign against its own people. We desire to see an end to the longest civil war in the world, but we are unable to do this alone. We're ready and committed to witness peace in this very generation. After all, it was largely thanks to the British, Americans, and then Chinese collaboration, which initiated from the Northeast India, which firstly liberated the Kachin Hills and the rest of Burma. We plead your help again, and thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Gumsan Ong, for your very sobering and thought-provoking briefing and the clear recommendations at the end. I'm now going to give the floor to Security Council members who wish to speak. Altogether, I have around 17 speakers inscribed on the list, so I do encourage colleagues to be clear and concise where possible. So my first 3 speakers will be Ambassador Abari for Niger, Ambassador Yul for Norway, and Ambassador Ladeb for Tunisia. Abari, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Dame Barbara. Allow me at the outset to commend the United Kingdom for convening this timely meeting on the situation in Myanmar. The meeting is indeed timely in light of the rapidly deteriorating security and humanitarian situation and the urgent need for the international community and the United Nations in particular to help the Burmese people navigate through these challenging times for their country. I would like at this stage to thank Ms. Susanna Lasso and Mr. Nsang for their interventions and for providing us with the latest on the situation in Myanmar and also their perspectives. Madam Chair, the current situation in Myanmar is concerning and constitutes a setback for the democracy the people of this country to so aspire to. The hope for the constructive dialogue among all parties that arose from the adoption of the 5-point consensus by Asean is fading for lack of progress in its implementation of in the implementation of this roadmap. Instead, what has become increasingly clear is that the country is headed toward a protracted crisis that can have potentially disastrous spillover effects on neighboring countries, as many have mentioned today. It is therefore imperative that the United Nations continue working with ASEAN to revive and expeditiously implement this 5-point consensus. As my delegation has expressed on numerous occasions, the local character of the security and political challenges that Myanmar faces pushes us to give primacy to regional organizations such as ASEAN, since they have a better understanding of the root causes of conflicts that can enable to bring the parties to a negotiation table. It is equally important that we make use of all diplomatic channels and means of pressure available, including the good offices of the Special Envoy and other concerned countries that have a sway on the Myanmar military in order to move beyond the current status quo. Madam Chair, against this backdrop, we should keep in mind that immediate attention must be given to the humanitarian situation coupled with the sharp increase in COVID-19 cases. This is a unique opportunity to put aside our political divergences and engage in a cooperative manner to prevent a more devastating third wave of infections in Myanmar in accordance with the Resolution 2532 and 2565. We should also reiterate that any assistance takes fully into account the looming hunger crisis, the collapse of the banking system, but also the plight of minorities and other displaced communities like the Rohingyas. I thank you, Dam Barbara.
Thank you, Barry. I'm going to give the floor now to Norway. Mona, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for convening this meeting, and thank you to the briefers. Exchanges directly with civil society are highly important to the work of the Security Council, particularly in this open format. As we have heard from the briefers, the situation in Myanmar continues to worsen drastically. We are now faced with a multifaceted catastrophe with severe humanitarian and human rights implications. Violence and fighting continues to cause death, displacement and disruption to critical services like healthcare and education. The spread of COVID-19 is increasing, death tolls are rising sharply, and the military are claiming the little treatment and protective gear available. Medical personnel are reportedly attacked and arbitrarily arrested, and the economy is collapsing. Yet we have seen no serious efforts towards a de-escalation or dialogue. The catastrophe is caused by the military's blatant disregard for democratic principles, their brutal crackdown against civilians, and their unwillingness to protect their own population. We reiterate our call for the military to immediately return to civilian rule, respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, release all political detainees, and ensure safe and unimpeded humanitarian access to all people in need. We also call for all armed groups to refrain from the use of violence. Chair, as we are especially concerned about the violence targeted at women protesters, human rights defenders, and reprisals against them. Women and youth organizations are at the front lines in the fight for democratic rights. Effort must be made to ensure their security, rights, and their direct influence in decisions about Myanmar. Children's rights also continue to be violated, with 72 children reportedly killed during peaceful demonstrations. There should be no question that this is unacceptable. The situation of the Rohingya minority in particular also remains dire. Focus on their precarious situation cannot be lost. What we are witnessing in Myanmar is a serious threat to international peace and security. The ongoing crisis has led to an upsurge in shadow economies and irregular flows of weapons to and within the country. And refugees flow to neighboring countries contribute to instability and the spread of COVID-19. We must act. There has been broad support for ASEAN and the 5-point plan. Yet, 3 months have now passed since the plan was agreed. We strongly urge ASEAN member states to make full use of the August ministerial meeting to make concrete progress on implementation. We continue to call on ASEAN to engage with all parties, including the democratic opposition, and reiterate the importance of strengthened cooperation with the UN, where joint initiative could include cooperation on all provisions of humanitarian protection and assistance, and ASEAN UN civilian protection monitoring mechanism, and collaboration between the two special envoys as soon as the ASEAN special envoy is appointed. We also call on the UN and humanitarian partners to activate the protection cluster, including in urban areas, and to scale up protection services. The rampant spread of COVID-19 must be addressed immediately to facilitate delivery and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. All parties must engage in a sustained humanitarian pause. Resolution 2565 must be urgently implemented in Myanmar. In line with this, we call on the Secretary General to conduct a swift country assessment in Myanmar on the impact of the crisis of COVID-19 control and to provide recommendations. Member states with particular leverage in Myanmar should renew their call for the Myanmar military to cease operations against civilians and civilian infrastructure, including medical staff and facilities. The Security Council, too, must continue to discuss the situation in Myanmar on a regular basis to assess and to explore further measures needed. Chair, finally, we thank the briefers again for their efforts and bravery in restoring democracy. Please be assured that Norway stands with the people of Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mona, for your remarks. I now give the floor to Ambassador Ladeb from Tunisia. You have the floor.
Thank you, Barbara. At the outset, I thank the United Kingdom for organizing this meeting on the situation in Myanmar. I also thank Ms. Susanna Lahlaso and Mr. Nsang for their insightful briefings. Madam Chair, Tunisia remains deeply concerned by the situation in Myanmar and the increasing number of innocent civilian lives lost, including among women and children. Any action that would further aggravate the situation on the ground should be avoided. We call again for an immediate end of violence, for the release of all the arbitrarily detained persons, and for all parties to engage in a meaningful dialogue in order to restore peace and the legitimate order. We reiterate in this regard the importance of the respect of democracy, rule of law, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. We also call for an unhindered humanitarian access and for more international support to Myanmar in light of the increasing number of internally displaced persons and the dangerous surge of coronavirus infections and deaths in the country. In this connection, we reiterate the importance of the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2532 and 2565 to put an end to violence and allow the swift and unhindered access to medical care and vaccination to prevent a major outbreak of the pandemic that would have devastating consequences for the health and economy of the population in Myanmar. Madam Chair, Tunisia reiterates also its support to ASEAN efforts to help find an acceptable, peaceful solution to the crisis in Myanmar and we look forward to the implementation of the 5-point consensus reached during the ASEAN leaders meeting of April 24th, 2021. We also commend the endeavor of the Secretary General Special Envoy to initiate an inclusive dialogue between all relevant parties in Myanmar and hope that this dialogue will materialize soon. We welcome the plan to include the Rohingya issue as one of the topics of the national dialogue. We reiterate in this regard our call for the recognition by Myanmar of the fundamental rights of the Rohingya, including their right to full citizenship and for the creation of the conditions conducive to the safe, voluntary, sustainable, and dignified return of all refugees. I thank you.
Thank you, Tarek, for your remarks. My next three speakers will be Estonia, Ireland, and France. I give the floor to Ambassador Lipon, the Chargé d'Affaires of Estonia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I join others in thanking the briefers for their interventions today. We have heard clearly how the conflict in Myanmar has further deteriorated in the past weeks and poses a real threat to regional stability. Estonia is deeply concerned about the level of violence and the unprecedented scale of attacks against civilians in Myanmar, including against children and women. With almost 1,000 people killed, thousands more arbitrarily arrested, and nearly 200,000 people displaced, the military coup has had irreversible political, economic, and humanitarian consequences. Estonia strongly condemns the coup and all unlawful actions by the military. We call for an end to the killings and violence, the immediate and unconditional release of all detainees, and accountability for all those responsible for the crimes committed. Moreover, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to worsen the already dire situation for the people of Myanmar. The combined effect of COVID and the coup has stretched the already weakened healthcare system to a point of total collapse. Ongoing attacks by the security forces against medical personnel and facilities are unacceptable and only fuel the public health crisis. It is important to coordinate a COVID response that includes a humanitarian ceasefire and a vaccination program to prevent the unchecked spread of the pandemic. However, these vaccinations cannot be tied to politics. Necessary measures need to be taken that allow hospitals to operate, that support the medical workers, and make vital medical supplies and oxygen available. In the face of this acute humanitarian situation in Myanmar, we urge the military authorities to stop the blockade and allow humanitarian aid to be delivered to all those in need. We commend the United Nations and other organizations who have provided immediate assistance in this crisis. It is imperative to ensure that all UN bodies and international mechanisms have access to Myanmar, including the Secretary General's envoy, Ms. Christine Schreiner-Bergner. Speaking of the humanitarian situation, we also cannot forget that almost 1 million Rohingya people are living in difficult conditions and require a sustainable solution. Madam Chair, the Security Council has the legitimacy to protect nations at risk, so we have to strengthen our efforts to respond to the pleas of the people of Myanmar. We reiterate the call on all states to refrain from supplying weapons to the military authority. It is time for a constructive dialogue among all parties in order to find a peaceful solution and address the root causes of the conflict. ASEAN has a key role to play in Myanmar. Estonia supports the ongoing efforts of the alliance and encourages additional steps to accelerate the process of the 5-point consensus. Timely action and comprehensive implementation of all commitments is crucial. Furthermore, we look forward to the appointment of an ASEAN envoy as soon as possible. Madam Chair, Estonia supports the path chosen by the people of Myanmar towards democracy and rule of law. We reiterate the need to ensure full respect for their human rights and fundamental freedoms. The international community cannot remain idle while Myanmar falls into disarray, but must come to a solution through common efforts. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Andre, for your remarks. I give the floor now to Ambassador Flynn of Ireland.
Thank you, Chair, and many thanks to the UK for convening this timely Arria meeting. I would also like to thank our briefers for their really vivid descriptions of the increasingly complicated crisis facing Myanmar. Resolution 2565, adopted by this Council in the same month the coup unfolded in Myanmar, was a collective recognition that those living in conflict-racked countries were the least prepared to add the challenge of pandemic response to their heavy burdens. Today's briefers clearly confirmed the awful truth of that for Myanmar. During previous meetings, we've consistently expressed our concerns regarding the humanitarian and healthcare crises in Myanmar. Ireland repeats the call for an immediate cessation of hostilities to facilitate a national, regional, and international response to the COVID crisis in Myanmar. The international community must act with urgency and explore all possible avenues to ensure access to urgent healthcare, vaccine access, and vaccine education. We pay tribute to the human rights defenders, notably the many women human rights defenders working tirelessly to support the population at this time. We know that to protect all, we must vaccinate all. However, in Myanmar, that protection is being denied to those who claim to lead. We are deeply concerned at reports of violence against healthcare workers, the arrest of doctors for the provision of care, restrictions on access to life-saving healthcare and oxygen, and chronic shortages of vital sanitary protection. Reports that non-medical decisions determine the allocation of scarce vaccines are deplorable. The COVID situation in detention facilities, overpopulated since the coup, is also deeply troubling. The pandemic has rendered millions in Myanmar even more vulnerable, particularly women, children, ethnic minorities, and internally displaced persons, many of whom have been subject to systematic attacks and human rights violations by Myanmar's military, including sexual and gender-based violence. During this new phase of the crisis, we cannot forget the Rohingya. Work to address the root causes of instability and violence in Myanmar, including in Rakhine State, remain crucial. The delivery of humanitarian aid is not a political act. Those delivering aid must be protected and respected. We call on all actors in Myanmar to recognize the principles underlining the delivery of humanitarian aid and to adhere to them. While thousands of lives have been lost to violence and to COVID-19, the ability to prevent further tragedy is within our grasp, but we must collectively act, and we must act now. Safe and reliable humanitarian access, including through cross-border corridors, has to be guaranteed. An immediate ceasefire outlined in Resolution 2565 is a prerequisite for an impactful humanitarian response. We reiterate the call for a truly global and equitable rollout of life-saving COVID vaccines. As Mike Ryan of the WHO has clearly and repeatedly reminded, none of us are safe until all of us are safe. These are not new solutions to the humanitarian and healthcare crisis in Myanmar, but they are most urgently needed. Today's meeting has left us in no doubt as to the scale of the challenge COVID presents in Myanmar. The international community continues to stand in solidarity with the people of Myanmar, but those with the ability to effect immediate change must do so now, prioritize the humanitarian needs of the Myanmar people, and turn the tide of the pandemic. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Brian, for your remarks, and I give the floor now to Ambassador Broadhurst of France.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you very much. And thank you for organizing this very important and timely meeting. And I would like to join my voice to those of my colleagues to thank the briefers, Ms. Susanna Halal So and Mr. Nsang for their presentations. First, I'd like to reiterate that we condemn in the strongest term the use of violence and the many actions that have undermined the rule of law and Myanmar democracy since the coup on February the 1st. Opponents, journalists, human rights defenders, and citizens arbitrarily detained must be released. France calls for the restoration of democratic institutions, an inclusive political dialogue between all parties, and the full respect for the will of Myanmar people as expressed in the general election on November 2020. We do not recognize any legitimacy to the regime that emerged from the coup. I would also like to welcome the participation of ASEAN members to this meeting today. Their engagement together with the United Nations is absolutely key to resolving this crisis. We welcome the 5-point consensus that was adopted in April as a relevant first step, but it is now urgent that it be implemented without further delay. I hope that the members of this organization can actually update us today on the implementation, especially on the appointment of the ASEAN Special Envoy and on their mandate to engage in an inclusive political dialogue with all parties aiming at the resolution of the crisis. We remain also deeply preoccupied by the humanitarian situation. The political crisis has exacerbated existing fragilities in Myanmar, and of course, as was illustrated today, the COVID-19 pandemic has created new ones, new challenges. The international community has taken a pledge to collectively fight this pandemic, first in the resolution 2532, then again in the resolution 2565. So we must together ensure full, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access to all the people in need and an equitable access to COVID-19 vaccine, as well as medical equipment and facilities. So we really strongly condemn attacks against medical personnel and against medical facilities. They are absolutely unacceptable. All parties have to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law. I'd like actually in that regard to ask the briefers maybe about their views on the issues of the humanitarian access. How can we make sure that aid is granted and that it reaches every part of Myanmar? Secondly, I would like also to reiterate our resolve to ensure respect of international human rights law and international humanitarian law in Myanmar. The military is conducting massive violations of human rights and of international humanitarian law, which will not go unpunished. And in this regard, I'd like to reiterate our strong support to the mechanism put in place by the Human Rights Council, including the independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar, whose mandate can cover the period following the coup. Further violations must be prevented. The European Union has taken a third batch of targeted restrictive measures late June, and these measures target ministers, deputy ministers, as well as the Attorney General, who are responsible for undermining democracy and the rule of law and committing serious human rights violations. They also target entities that are either state-owned or controlled by the army in the gemstones and in the timber sectors. The army cannot at the same time arm the people of Myanmar and benefit from its resources. And lastly, I'd like to raise the question and the situation of the Rohingya minority. Their situation is worsening as the prospect of a voluntary, dignified, safe, and sustainable return becomes more remote. The current crisis should not erase years of continuous efforts to improve their situation. And I would like to salute the efforts of Bangladesh in this regard in favor of the community. And last thing, the provisional measures indicated by the International Court of Justice in January 2020 must also be implemented. And we also follow very closely the investigation carried out by the ICC. I thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. My next three speakers will be the United States, Mexico, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Ambassador De Laurentiis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Barbara, and thanks to the United Kingdom for calling for today's important discussion, and thank you to both briefers for your important perspectives. Humanitarian aid workers inside Burma are sounding the alarm. As a direct result of the military's brutality and administrative failure since its coup 6 months ago, Burma is reeling from a surge in COVID-19 cases. This burgeoning health catastrophe comes at a time when hundreds of thousands of people remain internally displaced by the recent violence, with the World Food Program projecting between 1.5 and 2.8 million additional people in the country could now be at risk of food insecurity. In its updated humanitarian response plan for Burma, the UN warned that the country, quote, may be on the cusp of a much broader humanitarian crisis, close quote. The warning signs are loud and clear. The international community and this council must take them seriously before it's too late. We must call for unhindered access for aid organizations to deliver humanitarian assistance in an impartial and neutral manner consistent with humanitarian principles. We must ensure the safety of humanitarian workers and beneficiaries. We must press the authorities to provide equitable access to personal protective equipment, vaccines, and resources to treat those infected with COVID-19. And we must urge the military to allow civil society to provide the people of Burma with medical resources to treat and detect COVID-19. The military must also protect the health and welfare of all detainees who are especially vulnerable, and we insist on the release of all those unjustly detained. The military's refusal to take these simple, humane actions lays bare its intent to act only in its narrow self-interest. A professional military defends its country, but Burma's military has only continued a crackdown to deepen its grip on power at a time when the people of Burma face escalating threats from disease and hunger. The military has not honored its commitments under the Asean 5-point consensus. In fact, it has explicitly walked back from them and has continued to kill and detain doctors, peaceful protesters, National League for Democracy members, and others. So we encourage all countries, particularly Burma's neighbors, to provide protection and refuge for the people of Burma who are crossing borders to flee persecution and ongoing fighting and violence. We will continue to encourage neighboring countries to also allow humanitarian organizations access and to respect the principle of non-refoulement. Amid the current political and humanitarian crisis, we cannot forget to address the challenges facing Rohingya, who remain particularly vulnerable. Many of those who led the coup in Burma are also responsible for the atrocities against Rohingya, atrocities we have not and cannot forget. The United States remains committed to helping vulnerable persons from Burma seeking protection and assistance, including Rohingya, and is the leading contributor of humanitarian assistance in response to the Rakhine State and Rohingya refugee crisis. But the long-term crisis in Rakhine cannot be addressed if the ongoing violence does not cease. So, to that end, we once again urge this council to press the military to reverse course. Now is the time for increased pressure to cease the violence and restore Burma's path to democracy. We all support a peaceful resolution to this crisis, but the military has explicitly said it does not plan to honor the commitments it made in Jakarta. So what are we waiting for? The longer we delay, the more people die. This council is failing in our collective responsibility to safeguard international peace and security, and it is failing the people of Burma. We must do more, and we must do more now. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Jeff, for your remarks. I give the floor now to Enrique Ochoa of Mexico. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. First of all, we thank the United Kingdom for convening this very timely Arria Formula meeting. I would also like to thank the briefers for their analysis and insights. Madam Chair, what began 6 months ago as a coup has now plunged Myanmar into a combined political, social, economic, and humanitarian crisis. The raging third wave of COVID-19 has added yet another layer to the plight of the people of Myanmar that requires urgent action and for the international community to increase its humanitarian response. I would like to highlight 4 points. First, Mexico reiterates the call of the Security Council resolutions 2532 and 2565 for global cessation of hostilities. It is crucial that the Tatmadaw and other armed groups stop immediately the spiral of violence. Second, the COVID pandemic is rapidly deteriorating the humanitarian situation, creating additional risks for the region as a whole. Limited testing shows that 1 in 4 persons is COVID positive. The public health system has collapsed as a result of the coup, and many people are unwilling to be vaccinated in a military-run operation, while the overcrowded prisons have become centers of mass contagion. It is critical to ensure safe, unhindered, and sustained delivery of humanitarian assistance by impartial humanitarian actors in order to facilitate COVID-19 vaccinations and medical care for all people in need, as well as for refugees in neighboring states. Third, Mexico fully supports ASEAN efforts to assist in facilitating a peaceful solution through a constructive dialogue among all parties. We are, however, concerned by the lack of tangible results. We join the calls to ensure the effective implementation of ASEAN's 5-point consensus without delay. Mexico renews its call for the immediate and unconditional release of State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi, the President U Win Mint, and other leaders, and further reaffirms its support to the Special Envoy Sharon Brugner, and underscores the importance of ensuring the complementarity between her work and the work of ASEAN. Fourth and last, Mexico is concerned at the widespread human rights violations in Myanmar. Reports of killing, torture, sexual and gender-based violence, hostage-taking, harassment of medical personnel, and attacks of the freedom of expression and assembly, including internet blackouts. We are particularly concerned by the intensity of violence against ethnic and religious minority groups, as well as by the violence against women and children. The perpetrators of this human rights violation must be held accountable. Moreover, the world must not forget the plight of the Rohingya people, many of whom remain in refugee camps. The commitments of Myanmar's pro-democracy movement to assure justice and full citizens' rights to the Rohingya is a very positive sign. Madam Chair, it is imperative that the international community steps up its solidarity with the people of Myanmar and provide principled humanitarian assistance. Moreover, it is crucial that we take firm, resolute, and unified action to help reach a peaceful solution in the interest of the people of Myanmar. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
No, we don't seem to have St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Oh yes, I can see you, Lasana. Try again, maybe your sound is...
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thanks to the UK for organizing this timely ARIA meeting on Myanmar. We would also like to thank the briefers for their insightful presentations. St. Vincent and the Grenadines remains concerned about the rapidly deteriorating security and humanitarian situation in Myanmar following the coup on February 1st. The ongoing political crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic have further exacerbated the humanitarian situation, and the people of Myanmar require urgent assistance in their fight against the pandemic. Recalling Security Council Resolution 2565, we call for the immediate cessation of hostilities and the equitable, safe, and unhindered delivery and distribution of COVID-19 vaccine and other medical supplies to affected communities in Myanmar. It is also imperative for the authorities to take immediate confidence and trust-building measures to promote vaccination campaigns to combat the virus. These steps are crucial now more than ever in light of the deteriorating health system and fast spreading of COVID-19 cases and the increasing number of deaths. The respect of human rights is especially crucial in vulnerable communities, notably in the Kachin and Rakhine states, where increasing armed conflicts has led to thousands of more people being displaced, including women and children. This is deeply worrying as children are easily targeted for recruitment by armed groups. We recognize the impact of these threats on civilians and the region, and we call on all parties to armed conflict to fully respect international human rights law. We strongly condemn all attacks against health workers and health facilities, schools, and other civilian infrastructures, and urge urge those responsible for these reprehensible acts to be held to account. Further, we reiterate our call for the immediate release of all those arbitrarily detained. Conducive conditions must also be created to ensure that those displaced can return to their homes in a safe, voluntary, and sustainable manner. Finally, Madam Chair, we reaffirm our continued support to the efforts of Special Envoy Bagina and ASEAN, and we call for the immediate implementation of the 5-point consensus. The people of Myanmar are in urgent need of sustainable collective efforts with support from the international community. Therefore, full and equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines must be a priority. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Lasana. And I'm going to give the floor now to Ms. Thoa Lay from Vietnam. Councillor Lay, you have the floor.
Madam Chair, the COVID-19 crisis. Madam Chair, the COVID-19 crisis and continued clashes and attacks on schools, offices, and civilian infrastructure nationwide, which have taken the lives of many people in Myanmar, are of much concern. In this context, we call on all parties in Myanmar to immediately cease acts of violence, de-escalate the situation, secure and hinder humanitarian access for those in need, and prioritize the prevention and control of the COVID-19 pandemic and treatment of those infected. At the same time, we urge concerned parties in Myanmar to immediately conduct constructive dialogue and practical reconciliation and implement the 5-point consensus reached at the ASEAN leaders meeting in April 2021 in the interest of the people of Myanmar. Towards the end, the international community should create an environment conducive to implementing the 5-point consensus and share with the difficulties of Myanmar and regional players through increased humanitarian assistance and vaccine aid. In all of these processes, fundamental principles of international law and the Charter of the United Nations, including the authority, political independence, territorial integrity, and unity of Myanmar, must be upheld. As a community, ASEAN and its member states have been utilizing all relevant mechanisms to assist Myanmar in a positive, peaceful, and constructive manner. Currently, ASEAN has been working to expedite the implementation of 5-point consensus in order to alleviate the humanitarian situation and cease the violence in Myanmar. Therefore, we call on Council members and the international community to continue their support for the efforts and the stand of ASEAN, including through providing support and humanitarian assistance through the ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance on Disaster Management. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Thoa Lay. And I'm going to give the floor now to Kenya. Gideon, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank the UK for convening this timely area formula meeting on the situation in Myanmar. Kenya remains deeply concerned over the deteriorating political, security, and humanitarian situation in Myanmar since the military coup in February. The military orchestrated unconstitutional change of government and continued detention of senior political leaders of the National League for Democracy is unacceptable. We condemn the use of violence and indiscriminate attacks against unarmed civilian and destruction of civilian property by military forces and ethnic armed militias. This has worsened the humanitarian situation, including through population displacement, lack of access to basic supply, as well as reported obstructions to the delivery of humanitarian assistance and relief supplies. Regrettably, the situation is compounded by the spread of COVID-19 pandemic, putting the civilian population at a high risk. The situation of political turmoil, insecurity, and COVID-19 creates a health and humanitarian crisis and will continue to worsen the socio-economic situation as well as destroy livelihoods. The responsibility of the military authorities and all other actors should be to ensure safety and security of all civilians in Myanmar. Madam Chair, notwithstanding the difficult situation, Kenya believes that a peaceful solution is still within reach. But this is only possible if all actors commit to unconditionally and constructively engage through the Asean initiative. Kenya appreciates the efforts of Asean and the neighboring countries and reiterates its support for the 5-point consensus, which provide a good foundation towards seeking a political solution to the crisis. The political process must be inclusive as possible for wider acceptance and ownership. In this regard, no effort should be spared in ensuring the participation of all segments of the society, including women, the youth, civil society, as well as the minorities. Last but not least, Kenya urges the military authorities and all actors to facilitate and hinder humanitarian access, including safe passage of essential humanitarian supplies and personnel as requested by the United Nations. We also strongly urge the military to work with UN agencies to roll out vaccination programs as well as in distribution of the humanitarian assistance. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Gideon, for your remarks. My next three speakers will be Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Malaysia. Ambassador Fatima, you have the floor.
I thank you, Ambassador. I thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank you, delegation, for organizing today's meeting and also for keeping the Myanmar issue on the Council's agenda. Madam Chair, the situation in Myanmar remains a matter of great concern. The lingering conflicts across the country, the violence, chaos, and tension, and the targeting of minority groups in the country have been particularly destabilizing, leading to cross-border displacements. Reports of a surge in COVID cases and gross mishandling of the crisis is adding to the misery of the people and spillover cases across borders. As an immediate neighbor, hosting over 1 million of the displaced Rohingya minorities, we are gravely concerned with these developments. Like everyone else, we want to see political stability in Myanmar. The current developments raise renewed fear of influx and are creating tensions in the Rohingya camps in Bangladesh. The shift of focus and waning interest of the international community about the plight of the Rohingya is fueling frustration and resentment among them, especially as prospects of return appear remote. The prolonged presence of the Rohingyas in Cox's Bazar is also creating tensions in the host community. The potential security ramifications of the protracted Rohingya crisis are real, both for Bangladesh as well as for the region. We have alerted the Council of those ramifications on multiple occasions and have urged it to address the fundamental and deep-rooted problems in Myanmar, which are at the heart of the problems faced by the minorities like the Rohingyas, and as we are witnessing yet again, playing out against them in the current crisis. The minorities are increasingly vulnerable in their own country. Despite the many calls from various UN mechanisms and other stakeholders, the response from the Security Council has remained slow, inadequate, and ineffective, and its failure to act is only compounding the crisis. Madam Chair, let me highlight a few points on today's agenda. Firstly, the engagement of ASEAN in Myanmar, including the conclusion of its 5-point agreement, is a welcome and encouraging development. However, we are yet to see any real impact of the agreement on the ground. ASEAN, with its access and stake in Myanmar, is uniquely placed to play an important role in resolving the current crisis. We thank ASEAN for highlighting the Rohingya crisis in the outcome document. Resolving the Rohingya crisis is critically important for regional stability, and ASEAN can support urgent actions for the safe and sustainable return of the Rohingya to Myanmar and ensuring their reintegration in the Myanmar society. Secondly, Madam Chair, ASEAN's role aside, the primary responsibility of addressing threats to international peace continues to remain with the Council. The Council must use all the tools at its disposal to bring an end to the ever-deteriorating crisis in Myanmar. We would also like to see the Council focus on addressing the root causes of Myanmar's crisis, including by improving the situation on the ground and enabling safe and sustainable return of the Rohingya and other displaced people. Council members with influence over Myanmar have an important role to play in this regard. The deeply entrenched culture of impunity, Madam Chair, that exists in Myanmar must be broken by holding the perpetrators accountable. To that end, the Council needs to back all the accountability processes, including those in the ICJ and ICC. Finally, Madam Chair, we would like to urge the Council to hold regular open debates on Myanmar instead of confining such an important issue to closed-door meetings or Arria meetings. The affected countries and other key stakeholders should be able to speak before the Council and reflect on its responses. Transparency in the Council's work is critically important for building trust and sending the right message to the affected population and to those responsible for creating the crisis in Myanmar. We expect the Council to act on the situation before it becomes a bigger crisis affecting us all. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ambassador Abab, for your remarks. I now give the floor to Ambassador Koba of Indonesia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The current situation in Myanmar is alarming, unacceptable, and must not continue. We need to respond swiftly and effectively to address it, and all of us should play our role in it accordingly. Having said that, allow me to make 3 brief points. First, the safety and well-being of the people of Myanmar is of the utmost priority. All violence must stop. And second, the 5-point consensus of ASEAN should be implemented immediately. The mandate of ASEAN leaders is crystal clear and requires no further interpretation. It is a reflection of ASEAN's readiness to assist Myanmar in exiting the political crisis. The commitment of the military to fully implement the 5 points of consensus is key. Full access to meet all stakeholders and to travel must be granted to ASEAN Special Envoy prior to the commencement of the work of the Special Envoy. Third, the international community should be united in asserting our voice to all parties in Myanmar. We need to work together to bring democracy back on track, to bring peace and stability back to Myanmar, and to help the people of Myanmar with humanitarian assistance, particularly on COVID-19 relief, including by empowering the AHA Center. In closing, Madam Chair, allow me to also reiterate the importance of continued support toward the Rohingya. They deserve to have a safe, voluntary, dignified return home to Myanmar. Indonesia stands ready to contribute in restoring democracy, stability, and peace in Myanmar. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ambassador Koba, for your remarks. I now give the floor to Ambassador Azril Abdaziz of Malaysia. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, Malaysia thanks the United Kingdom for organizing this meeting on the situation in Myanmar. Madam Chair, Malaysia remains gravely concerned over the situation in Myanmar with the continued use of lethal violence against civilians and the threat of armed conflict. We are also concerned with the deteriorating humanitarian situation, which is further compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic. We urge all parties to exercise the utmost restraint to prevent the situation from worsening. Malaysia's position on Myanmar is clear and consistent. We reiterate our constant call for all concerned parties to work together towards a peaceful settlement of this crisis. We will continue to support an inclusive dialogue for political transition in line with the ASEAN's 5 points of consensus and the General Assembly Resolution 75/287. We also call for the prompt and unconditional release of political leaders, including Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, Hu Win Myint, and their associates. Madam Chair, as ASEAN has been playing a central role in ensuring peace and stability in the region, Malaysia acknowledges the high expectation of the international community for ASEAN to resolve the political crisis in Myanmar. Since the coup, ASEAN continues to actively pursue various engagements with the Tatmadaw in the interests of peace, stability, and prosperity of the country and the wider region. This has resulted in the issuance of the ASEAN 5 points of consensus that was agreed in April this year. Malaysia continues to strongly call for the expedient implementation of the ASEAN 5 points of consensus. we look forward to the appointment of the Special Envoy of the ASEAN Chair, and for the Special Envoy to be given access to visit Myanmar, as well as access to all parties concerned to start constructive dialogue in seeking a peaceful solution in Myanmar. In this regard, it is important that ASEAN's efforts are fully supported by the international community, including by all concerned parties within Myanmar. My delegation also believes in the importance for the Special Envoy of the ASEAN Chair to look immediately into the humanitarian assistance of the needy in Myanmar with the support of the Secretary General of ASEAN through the ASEAN Coordination Center for Humanitarian Assistance on Disaster Management, also known as the AHA Center. Madam Chair, Malaysia is also concerned that the current situation in Myanmar will have adverse impact on the Rohingya Muslims. Malaysia continues to urge the international community to provide political support for the Rohingya cause. As a country directly impacted by the Rakhine state crisis, Malaysia reiterates the call for a safe, voluntary, dignified, and sustainable return of displaced Rohingyas to the place of origin in the Rakhine state. We welcome the humanitarian assistance for the Rohingya refugees currently sheltering in host countries, particularly in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Madam Chair, in conclusion, Malaysia will continue to pursue constructive engagements on issues affecting the region in the interests of peace, stability, and prosperity. We reiterate our readiness to work closely with the United Nations Secretary General, the Special Envoy of the Secretary General, and other UN mechanisms, including the Security Council, which has a pivotal role to play towards finding a peaceful solution in relation to the situation in Myanmar. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador Aziz. My next two speakers will be Singapore and Myanmar. Ambassador Seah, you have the floor.
Madam Chair, thank you for convening this ARIA formula meeting. The rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation in Myanmar is of grave concern to Singapore and the region. The people of Myanmar have faced tremendous socio-economic hardships in the past months, and they are now buffeted by a third wave of COVID-19. The number of COVID-19 cases have surged since June 2021, overwhelming severely strained public and private healthcare systems. There is a critical shortage of medical supplies and equipment, as well as essential medical personnel. The number of deaths is expected to increase in the coming weeks. Heavy monsoon rains are also causing floods in southern and western Myanmar, exacerbating the already dire humanitarian situation. Singapore has consistently emphasized that the utmost priority is to ensure that humanitarian assistance reaches the communities in need in Myanmar. In this regard, we have strongly supported the expeditious implementation of the 5-point consensus, which was agreed by ASEAN leaders and the Commander-in-Chief of the Myanmar military on 24 April 2021. The 5-point consensus includes the provision of humanitarian assistance to be coordinated by the ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance on Disaster Management. Madam Chair, Singapore has provided relief supplies, including oxygen, through the Singapore Red Cross, which will work with the Myanmar Red Cross to deliver the aid directly on the ground. We are committed to do our part, together with the international community, to support the people of Myanmar in their fight against COVID-19. It is imperative that the Myanmar military authorities uphold their commitment to implement the 5-point consensus and ensure that humanitarian assistance reaches the affected communities directly in a timely, transparent, and non-discriminatory manner. We encourage the international community to continue engaging ASEAN and supporting ASEAN's efforts, including implementing the 5-point consensus. We also urge the Myanmar military authorities to ensure the safety and protection of healthcare workers, volunteers, and community groups providing COVID-19 relief and humanitarian assistance. Singapore will continue to support efforts of ASEAN and the international community to overcome the shared challenges of COVID-19, as well as to facilitate a return to normality and stability in Myanmar. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark, for your remarks. I'm going to give the floor next to Ambassador Kholmoei Tun of Myanmar. If there is anyone else who would like to speak, could you indicate that in the chat bar? Because this is, Ambassador Tun is the last speaker I have on my list, but if anyone else wants to contribute, you're very welcome to do so. Just put it in the chat. Ambassador Tun, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I thank you and your team for holding today's meeting to pay close attention on deteriorating situation of my country, the revealing tragedy that continues escalating day after day. I would also like to thank the briefers, Minister Susanna and Mr. Gamson. Madam Chair, it has been almost 6 months since the military staged an illegal coup on 1st February and orchestrated an absolute nightmare in Myanmar. Amid a raging pandemic, the continued terror of the military has caused unbearable sufferings to the people across the country. More than 930 people, including 75 children, had been murdered. Almost 7,000 were arbitrarily arrested. More than 5,400 are still in detention, and over 200,000 people have been forced to flee their homes. There is no sign of easing atrocity, killing, and arrest committed by the military. In the face of the military's brutal crackdown and threats of violence against their life and future, people have no choice but to defend themselves while their calls for international action have not been heeded with concrete action yet. However, the exercise of self-defense and resistance to the military's violence will not lead us to condone any attacks against civilians, schools, hospitals, and religious buildings. Madam Chair, although the international community has condemned the coup and has imposed some measures against the military, it is still operating in its own twisted reality, ignoring the international community's demands. The illegal state administrative council led by the military continues ignoring the calls from the international community to ease the violence, instead committing further atrocity amounting to crimes against humanity. According to the recent report of Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar of 5th July 2021, the mechanism's preliminary analysis of collected information concerning events in Myanmar since the military coup indicates that crimes against humanity have likely been committed. Against this backdrop, time is of the essence for Myanmar to save lives of its people. We always appreciate the commitment of the international community, including ASEAN member states, to assist Myanmar. However, the people of Myanmar are disappointed with the lack of progress in the implementation of the 5-point consensus. Even some ASEAN foreign ministers expressed their disappointment with painfully slow progress of the implementation of the 5-point consensus. Madam Chair, please allow me to turn to the public health emergency, including COVID situation in Myanmar. The military coup has caused a severe health emergency on top of the other military-driven political, human rights, and humanitarian crises. The military has been attacking healthcare workers and emergency clinics, making life-saving activities virtually impossible to operate. The military has been targeting healthcare workers who are participating in CDM with arrest warrants, detaining many and forcing others to hide in fear for their lives. The military's mismanagement and its unlawful persecution of healthcare professionals have resulted in the interruption of essential healthcare services in many parts of the country. Medications had been in short supply, clinics had been closed, international and national NGOs had been forced to curtail or reduce their operations. Millions of people are increasingly vulnerable and facing critical situations. Routine disease prevention measures, including infectious disease control and infant vaccination programs, had halted. Currently, COVID-19 cases are spiking across the country. Death toll is alarmingly rising, and the reported cases are considered to be much more than we know. COVID patients are in urgent need of treatment, and their families are in desperate search for oxygen. The military has inhumanely restricted selling of oxygen to individuals, resulted in many unnecessary deaths. The National Unity Government is working together with ethnic health organizations and has requested the UN and international organizations to provide medical and humanitarian assistance, including COVID-19 vaccines. We appreciate the positive response and commitment from the UN agencies and international organizations in this regard. On behalf of the National Unity Government and the people of Myanmar, I would like to stress that reaching such assistance and vaccine to the people in need and smooth delivery are critically important. We welcome the use of third parties for delivery of aid and COVID vaccination. In order to have smooth and effective COVID vaccination and providing humanitarian assistance, close monitoring by the international community is essential. As such, I would like to request the United Nations, in particular the Security Council, to urgently establish a UN-led monitoring mechanism for effective COVID vaccination and smooth delivery of humanitarian assistance, as well as for leaving no one behind. I wish to thank Ambassador Barbara Woodward and speakers spoke before me for their commitment and continued support towards the people of Myanmar. In conclusion, Madam Chair, I wish to emphasize that lives of the people of Myanmar are not cheap. During our fight for democracy, we have already paid high costs with death of over 900 people due to the military's atrocity since 1st February. We are determined. We will not give up. We will fight until the end of this murderous military in Myanmar. With the COVID cases surge, it is heartbreaking to see people gasping their last breaths on streets, lining up to refill oxygen tanks and overflowing mortuaries. Please don't isolate my country from the world. Please save people of Myanmar. What people of Myanmar desperately need is action. We demand for urgent humanitarian assistance and intervention from the international community before it is too late. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ambassador Kyomotun. I don't see any other requests for the floor, but before we conclude the meeting, I'd like to turn back to our briefers for any closing remarks. I think we have lost the connection with the spokesperson for Women, Youth and Children, Susanna. So I'm going to give the floor now back to Gum Son Ong for any closing remarks. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks again for the meeting. So with matters relating to ceasefire and humanitarian assistance, the principal challenge is trust. People have no faith in the junta system to deliver vaccine or even assistance. And the testament is that people are choosing sickness and death over being admitted into medical facility run by the military. This unprecedented situation in Burma warrants a novel solution. For example, like People's Republic of China facilitate with vaccination across its border in Kachin region, hence preventing a major outbreak. Different regions of the country warrants different solution. Calling for ceasefire without proper commitment or consultation with SAC, NUG, EAO, and CDMs, along with our neighbors, will face a mounting challenge in its implementation. And without personnel on the ground, it would serve as in the past, serve as a tool for rearmament. And what is apparent is the coup has failed. The army has no will, no capacity to safeguard its own sovereign territory, let alone govern a nation. And we are committed to not going back to the former status quo. And this is the best chance for us to end this tyranny. And in here shortly, I also would like to request to the army personnel in Burmese. Tatmadaw သားများကိုတောင်းဆိုချင်တာကကျွန်တော်အတိတ်ကအာဏာရှင်စနစ်ဆိုကြီးကိုပြန်လဲမပေါ်ပေါက်ဘူးပေါ့နော်။နောက်တစ်ခုကဒီမိဘပြည်သူတွေရဲ့မျက်ရည်ဒုက္ခကနေကြော်လွန်ဖို့အတွက်ကိုကြရခံစားကနေပြီးတော့ပြည်သူတွေရဲ့အရေးတော်ပုံအောင်နိုင်ဖို့အတွက်ပါဝင်ပေးကြပါလို့တိုက်တွန်းချင်ပါတယ် And also to the Kachin as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed to Nsang for your closing remarks. And that brings us to the close. So I'd like to thank everybody who has taken part in this meeting, especially our two briefers and the people of Myanmar that they have represented. I think it's clear that the challenges facing Myanmar are acute, and they pose a serious threat to regional stability and more broadly to international peace and security. So it is therefore necessary for the Security Council to remain seized of the matter and for Council members to work together in support of ASEAN's efforts to address the challenges faced by Myanmar and the region. This includes urgent efforts to implement the calls in Resolution 2565 and to ensure humanitarian assistance is able to reach all those in need, as well as encouraging progress on implementation of ASEAN's 5-point consensus. The UK will continue to stand with the people of Myanmar in calling for an end to the coup and a restoration of democracy. We hope that the upcoming ASEAN ministerial meeting will bring further impetus to ASEAN's work and that a Security Council meeting soon after will allow us to take stock. Thank you all very much. This concludes our meeting today. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Excellencies.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all.